Hello, everybody. My name is Willie Ware, and I'm a deacon here at Mount Prospect Baptist Church. And uh, we would like for you to have a good time. The main purpose of this is to expose you to a little more of the enriched history that we have here in Rock Hill. But to give you a warm welcome, we'll have Miss Wendy Carter to come forth at this time. But before she does, let me give you a word of prayer. Our Father, we ask your blessings upon this activity. We may ask that you continue to bless us in a mighty way, but most of all, we ask that you continue the blessings that you have already bestowed upon us and the progress that we've made up to this particular point. These are other blessings we've asked. Amen.
Hello, everybody. I'm used to saying good morning, but I can't say good morning. So that means you got to come back tomorrow, okay? Tomorrow morning, so somebody can say good morning. But hello and welcome to Mount Prospect Baptist Church. As you can see, this is probably one of the prettiest, most beautifulest sanctuaries that we have here in Rock Hill. It's a historic place, and there is a lot of rich history that's here at Mount Prospect. Then you have people like me who've been here since the beginning of time, it feels like, so, we know about that. But again, we do want to welcome you to the program this evening. I hope that you are like me, excited to learn some more about the history of Mount Prospect and around the history of Rock Hill. A lot of this stuff happened, I can say, before I was born, but it's still, there are things that, you go, oh man, that happened in Rock Hill? So we're just very delighted to have you here. Please, please, please do not let this be the last time that you are here in our church and amongst us. Come back and see us. Come back and worship with us. Our doors are always open, and you are always, always welcome here at Mount Prospect. Yeah, I was totally tell you this. Before, when the program is over, there will be someone, again, we're still trying to stay within all of those COVID protocols, but there will be someone that'll help direct you out so that everybody's not going out at the same time. So if you would, please, at the end of the program, just be seated and somebody will come through and kind of lead you out, okay? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Stephen Turner. I am a member of Historic Rock Hill. I am 18 months or so retired from the city of Rock Hill. I love local history and learning about stories of our history in Rock Hill that nobody else knows. And it was fun uncovering these stories and sharing them with people. Gladys Robinson and I have been working together on the Freedom Walkway Committee for 6 years now, I think. And so we've uncovered a lot of interesting stories about people and events in Rock Hill. So this is sort of a continuation of that. Rock Hill has a rich, rich civil rights history. And so what we're going to be talking about today is just one piece of that, a small piece. So next. All right, the sponsors of this program today are the African American Cultural Resources Advisory Committee and Historic Rock Hill. Historic Rock Hill, that I'm on the board, and Jennifer Sandler over here is the Executive Director of Historic Rock Hill. We're an organization that's been around since the mid-1980s. Around 2010, we opened the White Home and have been caretakers and programming at the White Home for a number of years. But in the last couple of years, we've recognized that there's a big portion of Rock Hill's history that has not been told, and that is the history of our African American community. And so, working with the African American Cultural Resources Committee, we are doing a lot of things now that are really trying to share, to research and share the information of our African American community. I'm going to let Gladys come up for just a minute and tell you about the African American Cultural Resources Advisory Committee.
A minute. So, all right, that's all right. As he just mentioned, my name is Gladys Robinson, and I'm a native Rock Hillian, and I have served as chair of the African American Cultural Resource Advisory Committee for since its inception in 2012. I don't know if George remembers, but we didn't have an official name at that time, but you started this journey with us. You don't remember, but you okay. But anyway, when this committee was first organized in 2012, our sole purpose was to get together and brainstorm about what could be done to commemorate a section of Rock Hill where a very, very important part of our history had been torn down, and that was the Wilson Street, the Black Street area. So as a result of that committee brainstorming and working together over the course of about a year, what you see now is the results of that, of our initial efforts. The Black Street monument on the corner of David Lyle Boulevard and Wilson, excuse me, I'm having a senior moment, so work with me. David Lyle Boulevard and Black Street. That's where, back in the day, the street was lined with African American businesses, and they were all torn down as a result of the Urban Renewal Project. So that monument serves as a site for preserving the history of that area and of Rock Hill's history as well. That monument was dedicated in 2015. In the summer of 2015, the committee that did not officially have a name received a name, and we were asked to become part of the city. And we are now an advisory committee to the city. In the fall of 2015, a new idea was placed on the table, and that was the idea of what an African American cultural center could bring to our community. So that was the beginning of what is currently taking place, and that is the formation of a cultural center on West Main Street, and you're going to be hearing a lot more about it over the course of the months coming up. And some of you actually participated in the feasibility study that took place this past month and a few weeks before that. But anyway, the cultural center will be a place for preserving the history, and not only the physical history or artifacts, but making the community more aware of the significance of our cultural and how important it is to us as a people. We have a lot of work to do, and right now the African American Cultural Resource Center is serving in as the, I don't want to say, there's a word that comes to mind, but I want to think of another. We are basically representing the cultural center until it is all of the moving pieces are put together so that the cultural center can actually stand on its own. So we, as I mentioned, we have a lot of work to do. We will be coming to you for your support, and so far we have been welcomed with open arms, and we continue to move forward in our efforts. It's been a long time in coming. The name of the Cultural Center, in case you haven't noticed the sign that is out front, is the Williams Ivory Center. The Williams is for Simon Williams. Simon Williams built that home around 1915 to 1917. We have been told that he was actually a member of this church. So we'll be coming to you to seek additional information. The ivory represents Reverend Cecil Ivory. And for those of you who are old enough to remember Reverend Ivory back in during the Civil Rights Movement, he was the Martin Luther King of Rock Hill. And it's only now that this community is beginning to realize the significance of his role in the Civil Rights Movement, not only in Rock Hill and South Carolina, but across this country. So, and these are the kinds of things that the Cultural Center, along with Historic Rock Hill and other individuals who are involved in this whole process, will bring to light so that we can have a greater appreciation for the historic significance in our very diverse community. I took more than a minute, Stephen, too bad.
Thank you, Gladys. Next slide, please. All right, so this Freedom Riders Project is a collaborative effort of these I think 7 organizations. Next. All right, these are the goals, and so we started this work about this time last year. Our goals were to research what happened when the Freedom Riders visited Rock Hill on May the 9th, 10th, 1961. Our ultimate goal is to create a permanent public space in downtown Rock Hill that tells this story. I think you will see it's a significant story. It needs to be told. We'd like to create something like the Freedom Walkway, some sort of permanent public space in the downtown where this story is told to future generations. And ultimately, this was part of an effort to work with other community organizations to tell the full story of the Rock Hill movement, the civil rights movement in Rock Hill, which was a very, very significant effort and particularly during 1957 to 1961. Next. All right, so 60 years ago, on May the 9th, 1961, Rock Hill hosted one of the most important protests of the civil rights movement, and that was the Freedom Riders. Next. The historical context at that time. Again, this was in 1961. In 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were illegal and must be integrated. 1955, Rosa Parks triggered the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. That led to a civil rights, to a Supreme Court decision that segregated buses were illegal. 1956, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued a ruling that segregation on interstate transportation, on Greyhound buses, on trains, was illegal and had to stop. 1960, there was a Supreme Court decision, Boynton versus Virginia, where the Supreme Court ruled that even lunch counters and shoe shine stands and other kinds of businesses that were located within bus stations could not be segregated. So you get to 1960, and there's this history of court rulings that things had to change, but nothing had changed. And so the pressure was mounting for direct action, that people wanted to, the African Americans in this community, in this country, wanted to take to the streets, demand change, not just sit by and wait for it to happen. So in 1960, the lunch counter sit-ins began. They started in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960. By February 12th, they had started in Rock Hill, first place in South Carolina. Almost nonstop demonstrations in Rock Hill between February of 1960 and then January the 31st of 1961, when the Friendship Nine were jailed and put on work gangs. And then it was later in 1961 that the Freedom Riders came to Rock Hill. Next. So that's the national context. The local context in Rock Hill is that there had been a direct action civil rights movement in Rock Hill beginning in 1957. In 1957, Adeline Austin White An African-American woman was riding a bus after a long day at work. She just wanted to get home. She was tired. She didn't want to be on her feet anymore. There was a single seat left on the bus next to a white lady. White lady invited her to sit down. She did. And the bus driver pitched a fit, told her she had to get out of that seat. She could not sit in that part of the bus. She got mad, got off the bus. That led to a bus boycott. African Americans in Rock Hill organized a boycott of the buses, shut down the bus system, organized their own transportation system, bought a bus. They served the African American community for 4 or 5 years with their own transportation system. So a very, very significant, and this is 1 year after the Montgomery bus boycotts. 1960, the sit-ins began. And again, a whole year of demonstrations in Rock Hill. There were marches, there were sit-ins, there were kneel-ins at white churches. They challenged the white churches to let African Americans come into the churches. A whole range of protests were taking place during 1960. 1961, Friendship 9, and then next slide. The Friendship 9 were arrested on January 31st of 1961. They were released from jail, from the York County Prison Farm, on March the 2nd, 1961. And then 2 months later, the Freedom Riders came to Rock Hill. Now, that's not just coincidence that the Freedom Riders came to Rock Hill, so let's talk about that. Let me say, before we go to the next slide, that because of this history of protests, a year-long series of protests in Rock Hill, Rock Hill was a community that was just seething with racial animosity at that time. There was an active Ku Klux Klan in the Rock Hill area. There was a white citizens council in Rock Hill that was basically the Ku Klux Klan dressed up in business suits. So this was a community that was on edge. Next slide. So who were the Freedom Riders? The Freedom Riders were a group of 13 courageous individuals, black, white, young, old, male, female, who started off in Washington, D.C., riding Greyhound and Trailways buses. Their purpose was to go from Washington to New Orleans over about a 2 or 3 week period, stopping in bus stations along the route and challenging the segregated facilities that existed in the South. In a larger sense, this was just part of a larger challenge to the whole Jim Crow system of segregation in the South. Next. Okay, this is an application to become a Freedom Rider. The Freedom Rides were sponsored by the Congress of Racial Equality, civil rights organization based in New York. This particular application was found in the papers of Dr. Cecil Ivory. The application basically requires the applicant to acknowledge that what they are about to do, riding buses into the South and challenging the segregation of those bus systems, was a dangerous thing, and that they were putting themselves in danger, and that they were not going to hold CORE responsible for any damages or injuries that they might suffer. When these 13 people, before they left Washington, they prepared wills, they held a Last Supper, and it's a symbolic Last Supper because they didn't know what was going to happen to them. They knew that they were going into a very dangerous situation. Next. So, what happened to the Freedom Riders? They departed Washington on May the 4th. Between May the 4th and May the 9th, they came through Virginia and North Carolina. They got to Rock Hill on May the 9th, spent the night, went on to Winsboro and Sumter. We're going to talk about the South Carolina events in a minute, but first I'm going to take you to the end of the story. So next. On May the 13th, the Freedom Riders were in Atlanta. They met with Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King, while admiring their courage and giving them great encouragement that what they were doing was important and was needed, privately he told people, you will never make it through Alabama. He had experience in Alabama. He said, you're not going to make it through Alabama. And he actually, and talked to Dr. James Farmer and other people of CORE who were leading this, and early in the process tried to discourage them because it was a very, very dangerous thing. So on May the 13th, these 13 Freedom Riders boarded buses in Atlanta. One group was on a Greyhound bus. One group was on the Trailways bus. Next slide. The Greyhound bus got to Anniston, Alabama. Members of the Ku Klux Klan drove their cars in front of the bus, beside the bus. They basically forced the bus off the road. They started beating on the bus. They were breaking the windows of the bus. They broke the windows of the bus. Somebody threw a firebomb inside the bus with the people inside. They stood at the door and blocked the door from being opened. They were going to kill those people. The gas tank on the bus exploded. When the gas tank on the bus exploded, the people who were standing at the door blocking it saw themselves as in danger, and so they scattered. And when they scattered, the people on the bus were able to exit the bus. And nobody was seriously injured, but it was clearly an effort to kill the Freedom Riders. And it was an organized effort by the Klan. This bus was obviously not going anywhere. It was completely destroyed by the fire. Another bus came and picked them up and took them to Birmingham. Let's go to there was a second bus, the Trailways bus that left Atlanta. When the Trailways bus was boarding in Atlanta, members of the Ku Klux Klan from Alabama had come to Atlanta to board the bus, to ride the bus with the Freedom Riders from Atlanta to Birmingham. They warned other white passengers that were on that bus, don't get on this bus. And so when the bus got to Anniston, Alabama, and stopped at the station there, the Freedom Riders were told, they were sitting at the front of the bus. They had people who were sitting all the way through the bus. They were not respecting the segregated front and back of the bus that was common in the South at that time. Told them to get to the back of the bus, that they did not want them sitting in the front of the bus. This was Alabama by God, and they weren't going to have that. And so they ended up beating the Freedom Riders. Beating them seriously, so that beating them to unconsciousness, black and white. And I think some of the sources say that they were more vicious to the white people on the bus. And put them in a pile in the back of the bus. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the bus then went on to Birmingham. When the bus arrived at Birmingham, there was an agreement between the police of Birmingham and the Ku Klux Klan that the police were not going to show up for 15 minutes. And the Ku Klux Klan had 15 minutes to do whatever they wanted to do to the Freedom Riders. Next slide. So when the Trailways bus arrived in Birmingham, they were met by Ku Klux Klan people with clubs and sticks and hammers, and they were viciously and brutally attacked. It was just, it was horrendous. This is one of the most horrendous days in the civil rights movement in the United States. Next slide. After a few days, the Freedom Rides continued on to Montgomery, but these 13 people who had started out in Washington, D.C. were spent. When they'd been beaten up, they'd been firebombed, they were spent. And the Freedom Rides were threatened with dying in Birmingham, that they were not going to be able to continue. And a group of college students from Nashville said, no way. And they organized, this is Diane Nash, it's John Lewis, people in the Nashville movement. They organized hundreds of college students to come to Birmingham and to ride that bus to Montgomery. When the bus got to Montgomery, the same thing happened. They were escorted by state police until they got to the city limits of Montgomery. When the state police exited at that point, the buses went on into the bus station. When they got to the bus station, it was a repeat of what had happened in Birmingham. The Klan was there. The police had made agreements with the Klan that they would not be present, and so terrible beatings took place again. Next. So, from Montgomery, again, all this is being broadcast nationally. This is the era of television, and people are seeing this on Walter Cronkite every night. Students continue to come in. They're not going to let this freedom ride stop. And so the freedom rides continued on to Jackson, Mississippi, but now with National Guard escorts. The Kennedy administration has made certain that the freedom riders are going to be protected. They got to Jackson, and as soon as they walked off the bus in Jackson and started going into the white waiting area, everyone was arrested over a period of months. And this didn't just end in Jackson. Over a period of months, more and more and more people volunteered to become freedom riders. So they would all ride buses into Jackson. They were all arrested essentially on the spot and sent to Parchman Prison, which was a state penitentiary in Mississippi, a horrible place, a place of terrible reputation, particularly for African Americans. They served 30 days of jail in a terrible state prison for the crime of riding a bus and walking into the white waiting area of the bus station in Jackson, Mississippi. Next. So why were the freedom riders important? Well, up until this time, there had been progress with civil rights. There had been court cases. There had been lunch counter sit-ins, but ultimately nothing was changing. The conditions in the South were remaining the same. The freedom riders and the violence against the freedom riders brought national and international attention to the problems of civil rights in the South, to the violence that was enforcing segregation in the South. It made people change their attitudes. It made the Kennedy administration change its attitude. They were supportive of civil rights, but in a go slow, gradual way. All of a sudden, people saw the violence that was being unleashed on these civil rights protesters. And the decision was something's got to change. We've got to move on this. Next. So historians say, and I've got a quote from one author on this, that there's a direct line between the freedom riders and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that the Kennedy administration proposed to Congress in June of 1963. They caused change. They created the momentum for change in this country. So the freedom riders are one of the most important civil rights protests to ever occur in the United States. Next. So let's come back to Rock Hill now. Why did the freedom riders come to Rock Hill? Well, and is there a connection between the bus boycotts and the lunch counter sit-ins and the Friendship 9 and then the freedom riders? What's the connection between it? Is it just random events? No, there's not. Thomas Gaither, who was one of the Friendship 9, he was the only one of the Friendship 9 who was not a Friendship student. He was actually an organizer for CORE, Congress of Racial Equality. He was jailed with the Friendship 9. He served his 30 days in the York County Prison Farm. He got out of the prison farm. He was released on March the 2nd. Sometime between March the 2nd and 1st of April, he made his way back to New York. On his way back to New York, he had the idea. He was in a car with another CORE employee. They had the idea together of the freedom rides for civil rights protesters to ride buses through the South to challenge the segregated facilities. When he got back to New York, CORE agreed to that, to the freedom rides, agreed to send people on buses through the South. Thomas Gaither was assigned to be the person to map out the route, to scout all the different places that the buses would go. He was a native of Great Falls, so he knew Rock Hill to start with. He had been in Rock Hill with Reverend Ivory, with the Friendship 9. He knew Dr. Godlock of Friendship College. He knew the civil rights leaders in this community. He knew this community. And so it was a very intentional thing that he brought the freedom riders to Rock Hill. Next slide. Just repeating what I've said. Let's talk a little bit about, those are some of the leaders that he knew. That Rock Hill had a very strong, active, well-respected civil rights leadership. Reverend Cecil Ivory was undoubtedly the key person. He was the Martin Luther King of Rock Hill. He was the one who was critical to the to the bus boycotts, to the lunch counter sit-ins. He was the organizer. He was the impetus for all of this. Reverend Ivory, you see him there in a wheelchair. He was born with some sort of problem that made it hard to walk. He had an accident in 1956. He fell and damaged his back. He never walked again. He was profoundly handicapped. He could not get in and out of that wheelchair. He had to be lifted out of his bed into that wheelchair. He had to be lifted out of that wheelchair to sit at a table to eat. He had to be lifted out of that wheelchair to drive a car. Okay, and he had a car that was specially fitted so that somebody who couldn't use their legs could drive that car. So he was really profoundly handicapped. And it was in that condition that he led all these civil rights movements. Okay, and we're going to talk about that some more next. Okay, so the Freedom Riders arrived in Charlotte. The trips through Virginia and the other parts of North Carolina, nothing significant had happened. They had challenged the segregated bus facilities in Virginia and in other cities in North Carolina. Hadn't been any, they'd been successful. They'd been able to go into the white waiting rooms and the white lunch counters and that sort of thing. Nothing significant had happened. When they got to Charlotte, there was the first arrest, and it's kind of an amusing thing. This was the first and maybe only shoe-in of the civil rights era. One of the African Americans on the members of the Freedom Riders, a guy named Charles Perkins, wanted to get his shoes shined. His shoes were scuffed up, and so he went and sat down at the shoe shine stand in the bus station. And the person who was doing the shoe shines refused to give him service, and he refused to get out of the chair. And so the police were called. He was arrested. He stayed in jail for a couple of days. The case was ultimately thrown out because there were Supreme Court rulings that it was illegal for those facilities associated with interstate transportation to be segregated. So it's just an amusing story, a shoe-in, somebody getting arrested, being put in jail for trying to get a shoe shine. Next. Okay, so the Freedom Riders on May the 9th traveled from Charlotte to Rock Hill. Two separate buses, Greyhound and Trailways. The first bus, the Greyhound bus, arrived in Rock Hill mid-afternoon. John Lewis was on the bus. And the Trailways bus arrived a little later in the day. I'm going to read to you from John Lewis's autobiography exactly what happened when the bus arrived in Rock Hill. Okay, the Freedom Riders had a process that at every stop, there were two of the Freedom Riders who were tasked with going in and challenging the segregated facilities, one white, one black. And it was somebody generally different at each stop that was assigned. And so at this stop, it was John Lewis and a guy named Al Bigelow, white guy who was a former Navy officer, who were leading the group into the bus station. So as Al Bigelow and I approached the white waiting room in the Rock Hill Greyhound terminal, I noticed a large number of young white guys hanging around the pinball machines in the lobby. Two of these guys were leaning by the door jamb to the waiting room. They wore leather jackets, had those ducktail haircuts, and were each smoking a cigarette. "Other side, nigger," one of the two said, stepping in my way as I began to walk through the door. He pointed to a door down the way with a sign that said colored. I did not feel nervous at all. I really did not feel afraid. "I have a right to go in here," I said, speaking carefully and clearly, on the grounds of the Supreme Court decision in the Boynton case. I don't think either of those guys had ever heard of the Boynton case. Not that it would have mattered. "Shit on that," one of them said. The next thing I knew, a fist smashed to the right side of my head. Then another hit me square in the face. As I fell to the floor, I could feel feet kicking me hard in the sides. I could taste blood in my mouth. At that point, Al Bigelow stepped in, placing his body between mine and those men, standing square, with his arms at his side. It had to look strange to these guys to see a big, strong white man putting himself in the middle of a fist fight like this, not looking at all as if he was ready to throw a punch, but not looking frightened either. They hesitated for a moment. Then they attacked Bigelow, who did not raise a finger as these young men began punching him. It took several blows to drop him to one knee. At that point, several of the white guys by the pinball machines moved over to join in. Genevieve Hughes stepped in their way and was knocked to the floor. That finally brought a reaction from a police officer who had stood by and witnessed the entire scene. He stepped in, pulled one guy off of us, and said, "All right, boys, y'all done about enough now. Get on home." So there was a police officer standing there watching. Okay, next. So where did this take place? This was at the Greyhound station. This is, you see in the center of the photograph there's a L-shaped building with a bus there in front of it. This is where First Citizens Bank is today. This is back on the corner of Oakland Avenue and Black Street, where First Citizens has their drive-through. It's a parking area and a drive-through back there. That was the location of the bus station, and that's where these events took place. Next. All right, so we've talked about that. Those are the pictures of Al Bigelow, Genevieve Hughes, and John Lewis. Al Bigelow was a former Navy officer, retired, a very distinguished man who was a very strong believer in civil rights. Next. Lewis was another police officer came by after the attack. He asked them if they wanted to press charges. Lewis said, no, we don't want to press charges. We're not interested in charging individuals. We're here to fight against systemic racism. We're here so that everybody will love one another. Next. So the second bus arrived an hour or two later, and when the Trailways bus arrived, the bus station had been closed. The manager of the Trailway station did not want a repeat of what had happened at the Greyhound station earlier in the day, so 15 minutes before that bus arrived, he shut down the bus station. So the Trailways bus arrives, and there is a crowd of white people, angry white people, surrounding the bus station, parked on the streets around there. But they exited the bus, they got off the bus. Reverend Ivory was there to meet them, put them in cars, get them out of there. Several of the authors say that, that Reverend Ivory shook his fist, sneered at, glared at the people who were the greeting party that was there. Next. Okay, so typically the Freedom Riders, the places that they stopped were communities with historically black colleges and universities. That was because the colleges provided a place to sleep, provided a place for food, and it is so that they went to Friendship College. It's likely that some or all of the Freedom Riders lodged at Friendship College. Some of them may have stayed with Reverend Ivory, but that was the center, and it was that in Rock Hill, it was Friendship College that was the sponsor of the visit to Rock Hill. Next. So the Freedom Riders that night had dinner at the home of Reverend Ivory. We are told that they discussed the civil rights movement. Later, next slide, there was a community meeting at New Mount Olivet AME Zion Church. It is said that it was a joyous and exuberant meeting, that Reverend Ivory hosted the meeting. He praised the courage of the Freedom Riders. And they concluded the evening with the singing of freedom songs. One of the things that we have not been able to find that we would dearly love to find is this was 60 years ago. There has to be somebody who was a teenager in Rock Hill at that time, or young adult, who is still alive today that was there, that can remember witnessing that community meeting. We have not found that person, but we would love to find that person. So in your circle of friends, grandparents, aunts and uncles, if you can identify somebody who may have been present for that meeting at New Mount Olivet, we would certainly love to find that person and get some eyewitness accounts of what happened that evening. Next. The Freedom Riders met with at least some members of the Friendship Nine. James Peck was one of the Freedom Riders. He said, it was a memorable experience to meet and talk with the Friendship Nine. This is important because the Freedom Riders adopted the jail no bail strategy. The Friendship Nine were not the very first, but they were the first of real significance to pioneer the use of jail no bail. And they served 30 days in prison, and so the Freedom Riders met with the Friendship Nine, would have talked about jail no bail, and weeks later, they were using jail no bail in Jackson and Montgomery and Birmingham. Next. Okay, so this is one author who's written on the Freedom Riders. You know, and let me back up. The next morning, they got up, they went back to the bus station to board the Greyhound and Trailways buses. But before they did that, they integrated those bus stations. The African Americans went into the white waiting room. The African Americans went into the white restrooms. They all got coffee and snacks at the lunch counter. So they achieved their goal. They won the Battle of Rock Hill, even though they had suffered the only casualties. Next. The attack of the Freedom Riders was reported all over the country. It was in the New York Times. It was in other newspapers in Los Angeles and Chicago. It got widely reported. Next. This is a report from the Afro-American, which was an African-American focused newspaper, national circulation based in Baltimore. They wrote on it extensively. Next. This is the article from the Charlotte Observer. Next. All right, same author. Says, in short, the beatings in Rock Hill brought the Freedom Riders to the national stage, beginning a run that would last several months, the effects of which would go down in history. Up until this point, from the time that they had left D.C. to the time they got to Rock Hill, the national media was not paying attention to the Freedom Riders. It was a nothing. Starting in Rock Hill, the Freedom Riders were something. They were on the national radar. And it was only 5 days after Rock Hill, 5 days after John Lewis was attacked, that Anniston and Birmingham happened. This was the first violence that the Freedom Riders encountered, and it happened only days before Anniston and Birmingham. Next. So, who attacked John Lewis, Al Bigelow, and Genevieve Hughes? We know that there was a group of people who were at the Greyhound station. We know that there was a group of people waiting for that Trailways bus. We know that there was a Klan in Rock Hill. We know that there was a White Citizens Council. We know that there were people who were actively harassing the civil rights protests on Main Street in Rock Hill. So, was this an organized thing? I think at some level it had to be an organized thing. Those people didn't just show up at those bus stations by chance. Was it the Klan? We don't know. We don't know who organized it, but it's pretty apparent that this was an organized thing to meet those buses and to attack those riders. Next. This is a picture from 1960 on Main Street in Rock Hill. This is a gentleman, the black man in the foreground of the picture is named Bunt. I forget his last name. He's an African American. This was when the first day of the civil rights of the lunch counter sit-ins. Bunt Gill was his name. Anybody know that name? Bunt Gill? He happened to be walking on Main Street. He was not part of the civil rights protests, but you see all the sneering white people there in the background who were there to oppose the lunch counter sit-ins and the marchers on Main Street and the lunch counter sit-ins on Main Street. That was typical. Anytime there were demonstrations on Main Street by African Americans for civil rights, there were whites who were showing up to harass them. And so he's been hit with an egg, and he's cleaning egg off of his hat. The person in the background there is Elwyn Wilson. Elwyn Wilson, in 2009, admitted that he had been one of the people who attacked John Lewis in the Greyhound station. Next slide. And it's really a redemptive story. Elwyn Wilson admitted that he had been in the Klan. He had been there at the Greyhound Station, part of that group that was at the Greyhound Station to attack the Freedom Riders. He recalled, these are his, you see his words up there, and he recalled the words of John Lewis. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said. "We're here for people to love each other." Those words had stuck with Elwyn Wilson for 48 years. And at a late point in his life, he could not live with it anymore, what he had done and the role he had played in attacking John Lewis and the Freedom Riders. And so he came forward, he admitted what he had done, he went to Washington, met with John Lewis, asked for his forgiveness. John Lewis very graciously forgave him. John Lewis said, "This is the only person who has ever asked for forgiveness, who's ever apologized to me for things that people have done." Elwyn Wilson and John Lewis appeared together on Oprah Winfrey. They were covered all over the national media. It's really a wonderful story of somebody who was a hardened racist in the early 1960s, who by 2009 had realized what a terrible, terrible person he had been, what terrible things he had done, and he was asking for forgiveness. Next slide. So, I'm going to back up. When Elwyn Wilson died in 2014-15, his obituary was in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, Chicago. His obituary was published all over the country because of the great thing that he did by coming forward. And otherwise, he would have been buried, might have gotten an obituary in the Herald. So, interesting. Okay, on to Winsboro. On the morning of May 10th, the Freedom Riders were leaving Rock Hill, heading to Chester. They got to Chester. The bus station was locked. They had heard what happened in Rock Hill. They didn't want any part of it, so they locked their bus station. Freedom Riders could not. They had planned to stop there, get lunch there to challenge the segregated facilities there. They were not able to, so they went on to Winsboro. They arrived in Winsboro. Two of the members, I think it was James Peck and Hank Thomas. James Peck was white, Hank Thomas was black. They were the two representatives the two who were designated to go into the Winsboro bus station and challenge the segregated facilities. Next. So they got inside. This is Hank Thomas. Again, you got to remember, these were kids. There were some older people in the Freedom Riders, but John Lewis was 21 years old. Hank Thomas was 19 years old. Charles Person, who was with them, was 18 years old. These were young people. These were kids who were doing these things. Hank Thomas went in. He sat at the lunch counter, asked for service. They refused him service. He went to the restroom in the whites-only restroom. By that time, the police had been called. He got arrested in the whites-only restroom and taken to jail. Now, I have a clip that we're going to play now. It's from an interview that I did with Hank Thomas. He's in his 80s now, lives in Atlanta, and he describes what happened to him after he was arrested. So. Just think about that. There's a 19-year-old kid. He's been arrested in a small southern town, been put in jail. He's not told what the charges are against him. In the middle of the night, they take him out of jail, drive him over to this bus station where there's a group of 15 or 20 angry white people. The bus station's closed. 15 or 20 angry white people. They're going to let him out of that car. This was a lynching. He got out of that car, started running, didn't know where he was going, didn't know what to do, in a complete panic. And who drives up beside him but Reverend Ivory? Now, again, remember, Reverend Ivory is profoundly handicapped. He cannot use his legs. Somebody had to put him physically in that car so that he could drive to Winsboro. And when he got to Winsboro, he couldn't get out of that car to go to the bathroom. He couldn't get out of that car to get something to eat. He was sitting in that car somewhere outside the Winsboro police station. And sometime during the night, he saw them take Hank Thomas out of that police station and take him to the bus station and force him out of the car. It's just an amazing story. At the end of that recording, Hank Thomas just broke down. He was crying because of what the fear, the emotion that all brought back to him, but also just the gratitude that he had for Reverend Ivory and him being there to rescue him in that situation. Just an amazing story. Okay, next. All right. One of the surprises of this research that we've done is that there's another connection to Rock Hill for the Freedom Riders. It's a man who was born and raised in Heath Springs, South Carolina. In 1959-60, he was a student at Friendship College and participated in the lunch counter sit-ins and the marches and demonstrations on Main Street in the spring of 1960. That was his first taste of being involved in the civil rights movement. The next year, 1960-61, he transferred to Morris College and became a student leader of the civil rights movement at Morris. And that's in Sumter, South Carolina. When the Freedom Riders left Rock Hill, next night, actually the next two nights, they spent in Sumter at the campus of Morris College. Two of the African-American members of the Freedom Riders were forced to depart. John Lewis had an opportunity for a fellowship in Africa, and he had to fly to Philadelphia to do an interview. And there was a minister from Greensboro who had to get back to his church to do a Mother's Day sermon. So now this carefully balanced group of black, white, young, old, male, female has lost 2 males and 2 African Americans, and it's not a very balanced group anymore. And so on the spot, 3 students at Morris College volunteered to become Freedom Riders. And this gentleman was one of those people. He was a student at Morris, and he volunteered to become a Freedom Rider. So he boarded the bus from Sumter on May the 11th to Columbia, to Augusta, spent the night in Augusta, and then on to Atlanta. He was part of the group on the Trailways Bus where the Klan members boarded the bus. He was on that bus. He was brutally beaten. Next. So he ultimately graduated from Morris, earned a master's degree from Berkeley in English literature. He served on the faculty and was a coach at Friendship Junior College from the 1960s until 1982. He later served as the pastor of Chestnut Grove AME Zion Church between here and Chester, and he died in 1988. This man was Herman K. Harris. And I know Cy remembers Herman K. Harris. Many of others of you who may have been around Mount Prospect or Friendship College back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s may have known Herman Harris. You probably didn't know that he was a Freedom Rider. You probably didn't know that he was one of those people who was on that bus from between Atlanta and Birmingham. So we have another connection in Rock Hill to the Freedom Riders. Next. Okay, wrapping up here, the Freedom Riders are really part of Rock Hill's civil rights story. They are connected to the Friendship Nine and the previous years of civil rights history in Rock Hill. They would not have been coming to Rock Hill but for Rock Hill's history of civil rights activism. Is part of the story of Reverend Cecil Ivory. And Gladys called him the Martin Luther King of Rock Hill. There's probably not a more dramatic story of Dr. Cecil Ivory than this story of him showing up to rescue Hank Thomas. The redemptive story of Elwyn Wilson, and then the courage of Herman Harris. Next slide. And then Rock Hill is part of the national story of the Freedom Riders. This was the first time that the Freedom Riders' efforts to desegregate the bus stations of the South was met with violence, only 5 days before Anniston and Birmingham. The Freedom Riders successfully forced the integration of the bus station in Rock Hill. They used nonviolence. I really haven't stressed that enough. The Freedom Riders were trained and coached in the use of nonviolence. When John Lewis was beaten, when Al Bigelow was beaten, they did not raise a hand. They remained nonviolent. And so they used nonviolence to achieve racial justice. This was the first national media coverage of the Freedom Riders. The connection to Jail No Bail from the Friendship Nine to the Freedom Riders in Birmingham, Montgomery, and Jackson. And then the John Lewis, Elwyn Wilson story, one of the most happy stories of the civil rights era, that somebody who had been such a violent racist saw the error and apologized for what they had done. Next. So, our goal, Gladys's goal, the African American Cultural Resource Committee's goal, Historic Rock Hill's goal, is that we've got to tell the story of the Freedom Riders in Rock Hill. And so I mentioned before that our goal is to create a public space in the downtown area that will tell this story. Next. So how can you help? Well, first is support the creation of Rock Hill's African American Cultural Center. Gladys talked about that. It's still in its infancy, it's still in the very early days, but over the next few months, you will be hearing more and more about the African American Cultural Center. And it's going to need people, volunteers, it's going to need money, it's going to need a lot of help to get that African American Cultural Center up and running. Second, do you know someone who may have been present for the Freedom Riders visit? If you do, we would love to talk to them and have somebody from Rock Hill who can tell the story through their eyes. Do you have photos or information about the life of Herman Harris? Since he was, all the records at Friendship burned when there was a big fire at the college. So we haven't been able to find at this point any information about him, any photos. I did this presentation on Thursday. There was somebody in the audience then who was from Heath Springs. And they said, Heath Springs is a small town. I can find information on Herman Harris. So hopefully we're going to find more information about Mr. Harris. And this is sort of more of the Freedom Walkway, but if you know of other people in Rock Hill who are part of the civil rights movement, or women who are fighting for women's rights, or LGBTQ people who have been fighting for their rights, if you know of stories of courage and sacrifice that in our community that need to be recognized, we would like to hear what those stories are. So please bring those forward. Next. That's it. So we have with us today two people who know a lot about the civil rights history locally and nationally. One is Dr. Jennifer Dixon McKnight from Winthrop University and from the history department. And we have George Garrison, who is a native of Rock Hill. He taught at Kent State University for many years. He's now retired. He also knows a lot about local history, particularly in African American history. So we'd just like to take a minute to see if there are questions or comments or reactions to what you have seen here today. And we have some people who hopefully are more able than I am to give you good answers. So questions, comments? Okay, Jennifer? So question is, who was CORE and what was their role? CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality. I don't know exactly when they were formed, but they were, 1940s, okay. So, Jennifer, why don't you get up and answer that question?
So CORE was an organization founded in Chicago, at the University of Chicago, in the early 40s.
It started out as an interracial organization initially, which was sort of the early trend for civil rights organizations. CORE didn't become, and it actually early on was majority white. Their focus was on housing discrimination in Chicago. As they began to sort of expand their work south, they began to have a larger African American membership around the 1950s. And so CORE, so the freedom rides that emerged in the early 60s wasn't their first attempt at a freedom ride. The Journey of Reconciliation in 1947, I believe it was their first, was that 47? Was their first attempt at a freedom ride. And so the way was already made. There was already a precedent set. I think it was about 18 people on that first ride. I think Bayard Rustin was one of the people that helped organize it initially. And they traveled down, I think they got as far as North Carolina and turned back to DC. And so obviously what unfolded in the early 60s was far more extensive. And again, the Journey of Reconciliation didn't get nearly as much national attention as what emerged with the freedom rides that we see in the early 1960s. But CORE is one of those organizations alongside SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is one of those organizations that helps usher in a younger arm of the civil rights movement. And so their approach to activism and protest has a different type of energy because you have young people who aren't as concerned about losing their jobs, right? They aren't as concerned about losing their housing. And so they are in a position where they are prepared to take more risks, and they do. And so we see organizations like CORE helping to organize those efforts.
And there was some friction between the NAACP
Yes.
and CORE and
Yes.
SNCC because CORE and SNCC really wanted to focus on direct action.
Yes.
And NAACP had been more focused on legal challenges and a more slower, more gradual approach
Yes,
to change.
and that was one of the, you're absolutely right. So there were a number, particularly on a local level, where particularly in sort of your rural areas of the South or smaller towns and cities where NAACP was sort of the civil rights organization. And when moments like this would come about, there was sort of concern about whether NAACP would be aggressive enough or confrontational enough. And you're right, there was concern about sort of them wanting to sort of go through all the proper steps and take all the proper protocols. And so in a moment like the boycott that emerged in Rock Hill or the boycott that emerges in Montgomery, NAACP was sort of, even when they thought about them as an option, they ended up having to go a different route because NAACP would be too gradual in their approach and they needed to strike while the iron was hot. And so there was often conflict.
Yeah. And it's interesting, one of the stories of Reverend Ivory is that he was the president of the NAACP chapter in Rock Hill, and yet he was also engaged with CORE and SNCC, and he was very much in favor of direct action. And so his life and his work is one of the places where the work of the NAACP and SNCC and CORE actually came together.
You'll see in some cities, I'm not sure if it happened here in Rock Hill, and you could probably speak more to that, Dr. Garrison, about. So you have in some southern cities where they would have what they call local movement centers that would emerge, so like the Montgomery Improvement Association, and it would be sort of an umbrella organization that would help organize all of the local civil rights organizations to keep down some of that competition and infighting. And so you have, and I don't know if that happened here in Rock Hill, but in some places they figured out how to pull leadership from the NAACP, and in Montgomery, for instance, pull leadership from the Women's Political Council and have those folks serve in leadership on the Montgomery Improvement Association as a way to avoid some of that competition and issue, and to create a more unified approach to whatever moments they were having.
In Rock Hill here, Reverend Ivory just seized every opportunity that he could in order to further the cause of black people in this city. And because he was the first to organize the bus boycott here at Rock Hill, he was like the elder statesman of the movement. And the young people coming along really respected him. And so when he, and Dr. Gottlock also, that's another individual that requires a lot of attention and praise for what he did also at a lower key. But when he saw that these young people, the energy that the professor was talking about, had all this energy, and they respected him in his work, he was able to join forces with them, organize them, and give them advice and guidance. And the other interesting thing also is that in 1957, some of you probably know Brother David from the Catholic Center there. He was just coming to Rock Hill, and he became really a protege of Reverend Ivory, and he became a part of the movement. And as the professor was talking about, one of the interesting things about SNCC and CORE, the NAACP, Urban League, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, they all had different tactics and strategies in their approach to the civil rights movement, which was a good thing. While there was some concern with the older organizations like the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Urban League about the youth, in fact, they was competing when Ella Baker called that meeting of the Shaw University in 1960 to organize the young people after the sit-in movement occurred in Greensboro, North Carolina. They actually wanted those young people to become a youth wing of the organization. And she advised them not to do that, so that they would be creative and be able to go forward with their own strategies and creativity with regard to the movement. And so there wasn't a whole lot of overlap with it. We've heard from this great presentation Stephen got about CORE here in Rock Hill. The professor talked about how the NAACP joined their efforts. But SNCC actually adopted that movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which when they heard about Friendship 9 and the jail Nobel, Steve pointed out, they may not have been the first. There's some discussion about whether it originated here or not, but he's absolutely correct that it gained national publicity as a result of its use here. And these young guys who did that here were not aware of it having happened elsewhere. But after they refused to pay their bail and went to jail, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee heard about it, 4 members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee from Atlanta came to Rock Hill and actually got arrested and went to jail themselves. And they began to utilize that tactic, jail, no bail. Of course, SNCC then would go on deeper into the South with their program as the bus boycott continued for the rest of the year by CORE and other places. But Rock Hill was the jumping off point. We initiated that. And that's the point that Stephen is making, that it all started here in Rock Hill. And we have to tell the story, about where Rock Hill started. And we had, oh, go ahead. I don't know about
I'm
that.
gonna say, during the period when the Friendship Nine were in jail, for that 30-day period, Rock Hill was absolutely the focus of the civil rights movement in the United States. I mean, there were protests, there were thousands of people showing up at the York County Prison Farm. There was, and maybe what you maybe are referring to, there was a group of students from Tennessee State University in Nashville who came to Rock Hill over a long weekend and did combined with local folks, did a whole series of protests. That's when the kneel-ins happened, when they went to the white churches and asked to be admitted to the white churches. So, I mean, there were people coming to Rock Hill from all over the place to protest what was happening to the Friendship Nine.
And that was a very integrated group also. There was the whites out there protesting as well as African Americans.
Other questions, other comments?
Stephen, I just wanted to point out, I think we have one of the Friendship Nine here. I'm hoping I'm not overlooking anyone, but Mr. Williamson is in the back here. He is one of the Friendship Nine. If you stand up, sir. Yeah.
Scoop.
Scoop.
We call him. You want to say a few words, David?
Okay.
Well, let me say a couple of words about my modest brother there. When they got organized, the Friendship Nine, they came from different parts of the city and from different churches. And one of them attended my church, Pine Valley Zion Church, that was Willie McLeod. These guys inspired us. We were younger than them. And while they were doing the heavy lifting, we were out doing little things around Rock Hill on our own, okay? For example, when we found out about David and Willie and Clarence lived in the same section of town that I lived in Boyd Hill, what they were doing. Then we tried to model what they were doing. A group of us integrated the park behind the stadium out there on Cherry Road. Interesting story. There was this elderly white lady that used to live on the corner. They had a basketball goal over there. They took it down. I don't know if they took it down because we started playing ball over there because I left when I graduated from high school, or they needed the space for parking. But we were trying to do exactly what they were doing. We considered them our big brothers. And so we integrated that part of it. Elderly lady sitting that lived on the corner, she would come out and say, "Boys, you don't belong over here. Why don't you go on back across the street over there and go home?" And so we said nothing to her, kept on playing. She called the police would come and ask us to leave. And we would leave. Next day we'd come right back. And so this went on, I don't know, for 2 weeks, and police stopped coming. And you probably remember the swimming pool. Some of you ran around Rock Hill at Confederate Park. An older person. Some of you may have remember William Jackson. His father used to run a barber shop down on Black Street, Mr. Jackson. But at any rate, he came by my house early one morning, and he was influenced also by David and Clarence and all those guys. And he said, "Get your swimsuit." I said, "My swimsuit?" Normally where we swam at over in Boyd Hill, we didn't need a swimsuit. which was down on the creek that ran over there behind West End school over there. I said, "Oh, we must be going down to Carroll Park to go swimming." Okay. And so I got my swimsuit without, and that's the other thing too. Younger boys didn't question older boys. Older boys came along and said, "We're gonna do this." We did that. Okay. It was the African way. I didn't realize it. When I was growing up, it's called the age grade system that was so practiced in West Africa, and it continued as part of the cultural legacy in our community. And so we left Boyd Hill and went across Cherry Road, went past the stadium over there, and then suddenly we started going over in the white section. I looked at Wayne and said, you know where we're going? Do you know where we're going? Where are we going? He said, don't worry about it, just come on. And then we got, to make a long story short, we got to Confederate Park. And I looked at him, I said, do you have any idea where we are at this point in time? He said, don't worry about it. We're going to ask for a ticket, and we're going swimming. To his surprise and my surprise, they gave us a ticket. We went in. You know how noisy a swimming pool is. I mean, you couldn't hear, yeah, it was so noisy. And when we came in, all of a sudden it got exceedingly quiet. He was a good swimmer. I was a fair swimmer. So he got up on the 12, on high diving board. I got on the little diving board. We dived into the 12 feet of water. We swam toward the back, and the white kids just kind of got out on the side of the pool, and we started doing laps. We did about 4 or 5 laps there, and it was one of them hot days in South Carolina. News got out in the community that there was 2 black boys at the swimming pool. The mothers came and collected their daughters and left their sons. They sat on the side of that pool for about half an hour and found it was so hot they got in the pool. Confederate pools in there. But that was all done by school. One of my friends who part of these heroes that is connected, and that's going to be part of what we're going to be doing here too, are those 6 students that integrated Rock Hill High School. One of them was Robert Totley, and Reverend Totley, he was the son of Reverend Totley. You saw his picture up on the screen. All of that was influenced by what the Friendship 9 had done also. And every time I see David or any of the other fellows, I have to give them their flowers, let them know we appreciate what they've done. It really changed the landscape for Rock Hill, and this is what Stephen and the committee is trying to do, Freedom Riders as well. All of this dovetails together.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, George. In conclusion, I mean, Rock Hill has a really rich civil rights history and the history of our African American community. I know George is working on researching the history of Emmett Scott and telling the story of the formation of Emmett Scott. First, it's just a school for African Americans, and later as a high school. It started out as a Rosenwald school, as Gladys knows all that history. But there's so much history in this community associated with the African American community that we don't know about. And so we're working really hard and to tell that story. Thank you all for being here today, and look for the next time that we get together and to tell some of these stories. Thank you. Okay.
If y'all would wait 1 minute before you leave, we're
Yeah.
going to leave in an orderly fashion.
Do you want to do that?
We'd like for Orlando, if this, oh, I'm sorry, go
No,
ahead.
Just a minute. Before we depart, I just want to take this opportunity on behalf of the members of the Freedom Riders Committee and all of the other organizations that are groups that are part of it, just to thank the members of Mount Prospect for allowing us, for giving us this opportunity to use your beautiful church. Give them a hand. When we first contacted Cy Parker about using this as a site, he very graciously said, I don't think it'll be a problem, but we just need to take it before the trustee board and make sure everybody's on the same page. And it didn't take long to get the church's approval to do that. And we've also agreed, I'm going to, as far as future activities that are sponsored by the Cultural Center and Historic Rock Hill, because we are unable to use the Cultural Center as a site right now, that the church has agreed to allow us to use their facility for any upcoming events. So this will not be the last time you probably have an opportunity to visit this beautiful church. This church has a very rich history on its own. And one fact that I'm just going to throw out there that many of you may not be aware of, but Mount Prospect was the site of the first classes for Friendship College. The classes were held in the basement of this church, and very few people know that. And I'm just throwing that out there as we all walk this journey of learning more about the history of the African American community. These are things that we're all becoming more and more aware of. And it's through just sharing our stories that we're able to do this. So thank you so much to the trustee board of Mount Prospect and to the members of Mount Prospect for giving this opportunity. You've been very gracious in allowing us to do this. Thank you again.
Okay, as you get ready to leave out, again, if you would, we're going to try and, or either that, I talk loud enough anyway. But as you go out, again, we're going to go out by road because, again, we're trying to stay within the COVID protocols. I have some information for you about the Historic Rock Hill and membership and some postcards. So if you would, please, if you are interested, just get one as we head out, okay? And again, like I said before, don't let this be your last time at Mount Prospect, okay? We need to see all of you in church tomorrow morning, okay? All right, because we got an African program going on. Oh, well, no, minute, y'all may not. The choir might not sound that good, but we'll be all right. We'll be giving God all kinds of praise. Thank you so much.